Environment changes. Some of those genes which are harmful in the present environment might prove beneficial, might even prove essential. The great geneticist Hermann Muller, Nobel Prize winner, who devoted much of the latter part of his career to this question, and he came from a very interesting political background, being a communist who went to the Spanish Civil War and observed the events there and came back an anti-communist and a pacifist. Hermann Muller concluded that genetic variability represents the hidden cost of evolving. If a population is genetically uniform with no variability, like many of our cultivated plants and animals, if an environmental change occurs, a new disease, a change in the climate, a new natural enemy, a poison, the population is defenseless and in danger of rapid extinction. And we have seen this again and again, with cultivated corn strains being ravaged by new fungus pests in the corn belt, for example. So these genetic variants, which may be harmful in the short term, may be beneficial in the long term. We think that cystic fibrosis, which is a terrible disease, and by the statistics of its distribution, a disease that touches some families who have members in this room tonight, is potentially advantageous in certain situations. We know that sickle cell anemia is advantageous in the heterozygous condition, that is, with one mutant allele. We think that cystic fibrosis, which is a terrible disease, and by the statistics of its distribution, a disease that touches some families who have members in this room tonight, is potentially advantageous in certain situations. We know that sickle cell anemia is advantageous in the heterozygous condition, that is, with one mutant allele, in areas where certain types of malaria occur. So the answer to the question is yes, more mutations may indeed be beneficial in certain environments and in the long run. But on theoretical grounds, we believe that both the mutation rate and the dominance or recessiveness of mutations on average, that is, the degree to which they are expressed, represent an equilibrium which is itself a consequence of long-term evolution. They represent a sort of an optimum, a trade-off between the short-term disadvantage and the long-term possible advantage.
Reverend Zirkle.
I have a rather long question that has to do with, well, I'll try to read some of it. When the Bible or the Old Testament was written thousands of years ago, the people at that time would not have been able to comprehend the theory of evolution. So instead, God may have used the analogy of 7 days to explain what may have occurred over millions of years. The Old Testament is largely symbolic and not literal, since most of it was carried down by word of mouth through thousands of years, which is not much of a question, it's really a statement. I'd like to say some things about the statement, however. First of all, if we look at the history of human beings over the last several thousand years, we will really rapidly discover, if you read their writings and we look at the archaeological record, that there's not much difference between them and us other than our technology. They have the same kind of dreams and hopes and fears and problems that we do. And they address some of the things in the same kind of weak ways that we do. Secondly, as far as the scriptures, we have in hand more copies, ancient copies of scriptural manuscripts than we have of any other manuscripts from ancient times. Far more, thousands more. And they have been preserved very carefully. Thirdly, if we do not look at the scriptures using what is called a historical grammatical methodology, in other words, we don't take them for what they say. If we do not do that, if we don't use the grammar if we don't let the language say what it is saying to us plainly, then language loses its meaning, and Scripture isn't really going to say much of anything to us at all. As I mentioned earlier, as we look at the Scriptures to this point, nobody has ever been able to disprove anything in the Scripture. All kinds of problems are brought up and argued about and discussed, but they're always able to be resolved. Finally, in the Scriptures, Christ himself says that the Scriptures cannot be broken. And if we are going to have a miraculous faith, which Christianity is, then we need to be able to stand on what he says. If he himself is not right concerning the Scriptures, then I would have reason to question the rest of what Scriptures say.
Dr. Gish for the final two questions.
Please try to dispute the agreement of certain fetal characteristics that are similar to a fish, that is, gill slits, a small tail, and so forth. Now, what this question is about is the so-called theory of embryological recapitulation. This is the notion that the human embryo, and all embryos, as they develop, recapitulate their evolutionary ancestry. The human embryo supposedly looked like a fish, and then a tadpole, and then a reptile, and ape, and finally man. That was the old idea. Obviously, it's still found in biology books today, and I see it all the time. I hear this notion all the time. This is a thoroughly discredited theory. It's been known to be false for many years. A few years ago, I debated Ashley Montague, one of the world's foremost evolutionists at Princeton University. I made that statement. Dr. Montague said, "That's right. No one should ever use that discredited theory to support evolution. The human embryo never has gill slits. It has a series of bars and grooves in the neck region which are properly called pharyngeal pouches. They never open into the throat and become slits, and they never develop into gills. The human embryo never has gills. These develop into such structures as the jaw, the lower jaw, structures in the middle ear, certain glands, and so forth. The human embryo never has gills. It never has slits. Obviously, it never has gill slits. There's just a superficial resemblance here that has no validity whatsoever. The human embryo, the tongue appears before the teeth, the heart before the blood vessels, the brain before the nerve cords. The heart goes from 2 chambers to 1 chambers to 4, not 1, 2, 3, 4. For this and many other reasons, this theory has been totally discredited. Furthermore, recently, an instrument has been developed which can be inserted into the uterus, and the development of the human embryo can be observed and photographed during its entire development, and that research has shown that the human embryo is uniquely human at every stage. If an embryologist cannot distinguish the difference between a human embryo and another creature, another animal, at any stage, he's just simply a lousy embryologist. Do you mean that teachers should be allowed to teach both creation and evolution, or that they should be required to teach both? The Institute for Creation Research does not advocate any legislation of any kind or court test or anything of that kind. We believe the better approach is one of education and persuasion. We would like to persuade school boards, both at the local and state level, that to teach the scientific evidence for both creation and evolution is the only way to guarantee academic and religious freedoms and good science and good education. Furthermore, polls taken nationally, for example, by the Associated Press NBC News poll, showed that 86% of the American people want creation taught in the public schools. Another poll taken by an evolutionist professor at Ohio State University of students, including science students in undergraduate classes through graduate students in science, showed that 80% of those students believe that both creation and evolution should be taught in the schools. We believe they both should be taught. We don't believe we should necessarily force that. Now, there are others who are less patient than we are and have introduced legislation to require this. I think there's a better approach. I think the tactics are better. They're a better way of doing that. Now, of course, this legislation would never have been introduced if the educators were doing what they should be doing. You know, Clarence Darrow, at the time of the Scopes trial, he just declared that it was bigotry to teach only one view of origin, that both should be taught. Now we've swung around 180 degrees. And evolutionists like Dr. Shapiro says that only evolution should be taught in the schools. And we should not teach both. But we think certainly that both should be taught. The best approach, I believe, would be to insist that teachers be allowed their academic and religious freedoms and to teach the scientific evidence for both, and certainly the academic freedom of the students would require that.
I don't think we solved the whole problem, but I think we scratched the surface, and as I indicated originally, the purpose of this was a forum to shed some light, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your questions, because they indicated that you are looking at this in a serious academic fashion. And I'd like to give another round of applause to our panelists and say good night.